In the second half of the 18th century, reports of Russian and British interest in the Pacific coast created a sense of urgency within the court of King Charles III. The vast, placid harbour, described by earlier maritime explorers, the Bay of San Francisco, remained unoccupied, a vacuum of imperial power that could not be allowed to persist. To fill this void, the Viceroy of New Spain authorized a colonizing expedition, a monumental overland push intended to plant the Spanish flag firmly on the shores of the bay. The man selected for this task was Juan Bautista de Anza, a seasoned frontier commander from the Tubac Presidio in Sonora. His expedition, which departed in October of 1775, was not a small party of explorers, but a mobile colony of nearly 240 men, women, and children, accompanied by over 1,000 head of livestock. Their journey was an immense logistical undertaking, a 1,000-mile trek across some of North America's most unforgiving terrain, including the Sonoran and Mojave deserts. The column endured thirst, winter storms, and the constant strain of moving a civilian population through a wilderness known only to its native inhabitants. After 6 months of arduous travel, de Anza's party reached the bay in March of 1776. He personally surveyed the peninsula, identifying a strategic bluff with a commanding view of the narrow strait leading to the sea. He marked this site for a military fortification. A short distance inland, in a more sheltered valley, he selected a location for a mission. De Anza himself did not stay to build the settlement. His task was to chart the path and select the locations before returning to Mexico. The duty of formally establishing the outpost fell to his lieutenant, José Joaquín Moraga. On September 17, 1776, Moraga led the settlers to the chosen bluff. And with the raising of the Spanish standard and the firing of muskets, the Presidio Royal de San Francisco was officially founded. This was not a grand fortress of stone, but a humble enclosure of brushwood, wood, and hastily prepared adobe. It was a fragile symbol of imperial dominion, a remote military garrison manned by a few dozen soldiers and their families, positioned at the absolute edge of the Spanish Empire. Its purpose was to project the authority of the crown and the cross into a land that had, until that moment, existed entirely beyond their reach. Just a quick announcement. If you enjoy this video so far, please subscribe to our channel, as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. Just days after the formal establishment of the Presidio, the religious component of the Spanish colonization plan commenced. On June 29, 1776, Father Francisco Palo, under the direction of Father Junipero Serra, held the first Mass in a simple brushwood shelter, or enramada, near a small lagoon named Laguna de los Dolores. This act consecrated the ground for what would be formally dedicated on October 9, 1776, as Mission San Francisco de Asís, the sixth of the 21 Franciscan missions in Alta California. The mission's purpose was twofold: to convert the local indigenous population, the Ohlone, to Catholicism, and to incorporate them into the Spanish colonial economy as a labor force. The process of attracting the native peoples was initially based on persuasion, with the friars offering food, colored beads, and cloth to entice them into the mission compound. Once an individual accepted baptism, they were considered a neophyte and were forbidden to leave the mission grounds without permission. Their traditional semi-nomadic life was systematically dismantled and replaced with a regimented existence governed by the ringing of church bells. The neophytes were taught European agricultural techniques, cultivating wheat, corn, and beans, and managing the mission's growing herds of cattle and sheep. They were also trained in trades such as tanning, weaving, masonry, and blacksmithing. This labor was compulsory and served to make the mission a self-sufficient and profitable agricultural estate. The social and cultural transformation was absolute. The Ohlone were compelled to abandon their native languages and speak Spanish. Their complex spiritual beliefs were suppressed and replaced by mandatory Catholic instruction. Traditional social structures, based on kinship and autonomous villages, were erased as neophytes were housed in sex-segregated dormitories under the strict control of the padres. This concentration of a population with no prior exposure to European pathogens proved catastrophic. Diseases such as measles, diphtheria, and smallpox swept through the neophyte dormitories with devastating effect. The mission's own records document a staggering mortality rate. For every one baptism, there were often 2 or more burials. Over its 60 years of operation, thousands of Ohlone were interred in the mission's cemetery, their population collapsing under the combined pressures of disease, forced labor, and the complete disruption of their ancestral way of life. The mission system effectively destroyed the Ohlone world, replacing it with a new order centered on the church and the crown. For decades, the twin institutions of the Presidio and the mission constituted the entirety of the Spanish presence on the peninsula. The civilian settlement, known as Yerba Buena, grew slowly and organically in a sheltered cove a few miles to the east of the military post. Life in this remote outpost was defined by a profound and unrelenting isolation. Overland supply lines from Mexico were tenuous and unreliable, making the annual arrival of a single supply ship from the port of San Blas the crucial link to the wider Spanish Empire. This vessel brought essential goods like iron tools, firearms, textiles, and official correspondence, but its arrival was the only significant contact with the outside world for the small population of soldiers, or soldados de cuera, and their families, the pobladores. A rigid social hierarchy, imported directly from New Spain, governed all interactions. The Comandante of the Presidio held absolute authority over military and civil matters. Beneath him were the handful of officers, followed by the enlisted soldiers who formed the backbone of the community. Status was determined by military rank and lineage, with a sharp distinction maintained between those of pure Spanish blood and those of mixed ancestry. Daily existence was a monotonous cycle of labor, dictated by the seasons and the immediate needs of survival. For the men, routines consisted of military drills, maintaining the crumbling adobe fortifications, standing guard duty, and tending to the Presidio's livestock and small agricultural plots. The women's lives were consumed by relentless domestic tasks, grinding corn into flour on stone metates, weaving coarse woolen cloth, rendering tallow for candles and soap, and raising large families in cramped, rudimentary housing. The economy was almost entirely one of subsistence and barter. A small amount of currency circulated, but most transactions involved the exchange of goods and services. A soldier's pay was often years in arrears, provided in the form of credit at the Presidio's meagre storehouse. Community life was centered entirely around the Catholic faith, with the chapel at Mission Dolores serving the spiritual needs of both the colonists and the neophytes. The liturgical calendar provided the primary structure for the year, and religious feast days were the only significant diversions from the drudgery of work, marked by community gatherings, music, and modest celebrations. This was a society suspended in time, a fragile and insular world where survival depended on military discipline, a shared faith, and the agricultural rhythms of planting and harvest at the farthest edge of the Spanish world. The monumental political upheavals that began with the Grito de Dolores in 1810 took over a decade to formally reach the distant shores of Alta California. While the Mexican War of Independence raged, the supply chain that had sustained the presidios and missions collapsed. The annual ships from San Blas ceased their reliable voyages, plunging the colony into a state of economic crisis and forcing it into a new era of illicit self-reliance. Foreign vessels, particularly those from Britain and the United States, began to appear in the harbour, engaging in a contraband trade for cattle hides and tallow that the Spanish crown had forbidden. It was not until 1822, a full year after the signing of the Treaty of Cordoba secured Mexico's independence, that a ship arrived in Monterrey carrying the official news. The Spanish flag of the House of Bourbon was lowered, and the green, white, and red banner of the new Mexican Republic was raised in its place. The transfer of sovereignty at the San Francisco Presidio was a similarly quiet, bureaucratic affair, a simple change of allegiance for soldiers whose pay was already non-existent. The transition from Spanish dominion to Mexican territorial status fundamentally altered the structure of power and policy in California. The highly centralized, top-down authority of the Spanish monarchy was replaced by the often unstable and chronically underfunded Republican government in Mexico City, which viewed Alta California as a remote and troublesome territory. The most significant policy shift came with the Secularization Act of 1833. Driven by Republican ideals and a desire to break the power of the Franciscan order, the Mexican government decreed that the 21 missions be dismantled. The plan was to convert the missions into secular parishes and distribute the vast mission lands among the neophytes. In practice, the result was a massive transfer of wealth. The mission lands, totaling millions of acres, were not given to the indigenous peoples but were instead granted in enormous tracts, or ranchos, to politically connected military officers and civilians, the Californios. This created a new land-based aristocracy. For the former neophytes, secularization was a second catastrophic dislocation. Freed from the missions but given no land or resources, they were left to fend for themselves, becoming a landless, dispossessed class, often forced into peonage on the very ranchos that had once been their ancestral homes. With the missions dismantled, the vast cattle herds that had once been church property became the foundation of the California rancho economy. This new order gave rise to a global trade centered on two primary commodities, cowhides and tallow. The previously sporadic and illicit contact with foreign ships transformed into a systematic commercial enterprise, dominated by merchant vessels from New England, particularly Boston. These ships, known as hide droggers, would undertake the perilous, multi-year voyage around Cape Horn to anchor in California's harbors. Yerba Buena's sheltered cove, with its deep water anchorage, proved to be an ideal location for this trade. The hides, often called California banknotes, were in high demand by the burgeoning shoe and leather factories of Massachusetts. The tallow, rendered from cattle fat, was a crucial industrial lubricant and a primary ingredient for candles and soap, fueling the machinery and lighting the cities of the industrializing world. The process was laborious. Upon a ship's arrival, its crew would often construct temporary hide-curing houses and trading posts on the shore. The California rancheros, whose wealth was measured in livestock rather than currency, would bring their hides to the coast. These hides were stiff and uncured, requiring the ship's sailors to perform the back-breaking work of soaking them in salt water, scraping them clean, and staking them out to dry in the sun before they could be folded and stored in the ship's hold. This commerce began to reshape the settlement pattern on the peninsula. The center of gravity shifted away from the decaying Presidio and the struggling mission to the cove of Yerba Buena. In 1835, an English mariner named William Richardson erected the first permanent private dwelling here, a simple tent-like structure that served as his home and trading post. He was soon followed by other foreign entrepreneurs who established businesses to service the visiting ships and the local rancheros. Yerba Buena began its transformation into a modest but vital mercantile port. It was a cosmopolitan outpost where Spanish-speaking Californios, American and British sailors, and a handful of resident foreign traders mingled, creating a unique cultural and economic nexus that opened the isolated territory to the powerful commercial forces of the United States and Europe. The abstract doctrine of manifest destiny, which propelled United States policy in the 1840s, found its military expression in the Mexican-American War, declared in May of 1846. For the remote territory of Alta California, the conflict was not a matter of land battles but of naval occupation. The United States Pacific Squadron, under the command of Commodore John D. Sloat, had standing orders to seize the territory's principal ports at the first confirmation of war. After taking Monterrey, the capital, on July 7th, Sloat dispatched orders for the occupation of other key harbours. In Yerba Buena, the transfer of power was a quiet, almost perfunctory affair, devoid of armed conflict. On July 9, 1846, Captain John B. Montgomery of the sloop of war USS Portsmouth, which had been anchored in the cove for several weeks, received his orders. He marched a contingent of 70 sailors and marines ashore to the small, dusty central plaza in front of the Mexican customs house. The village's few hundred residents, a mix of Californios, American and European traders, and native laborers, watched with curiosity rather than resistance. The authority of the Mexican Republic had always been tenuous and distant, and for many of the foreign-born residents, the change was an anticipated, if not welcome, development. With little ceremony, Montgomery read a proclamation to the small gathering, announcing the transfer of sovereignty to the United States. The Mexican flag was lowered, and a 28-star American flag was raised on the Customs House flagpole, accompanied by a 21-gun salute from the USS Portsmouth. The plaza was immediately renamed Portsmouth Square in honor of the ship. Captain Montgomery assumed the role of military governor of the newly designated District of San Francisco. He established a small garrison, issued regulations for civil order, and organized a local militia composed largely of the town's American residents. The transition was swift and bloodless. For the inhabitants of the sleepy port, the primary immediate change was the replacement of one distant, ineffective government with another, more proximate and organized military authority. The nearly 3 centuries of Spanish and Mexican rule over the peninsula had ended not with a bang but with a quiet, orderly naval procedure that signaled the beginning of a new and unforeseen destiny. The event that would irrevocably alter the destiny of California occurred far from the coastal port, in the remote foothills of the Sierra Nevada. Here, the Swiss immigrant John Sutter was expanding his vast inland agricultural empire, New Helvetia. To support his domain, Sutter contracted a carpenter and mechanic named James W. Marshall to construct a sawmill on the South Fork of the American River, in a valley the local Miwok people called Coloma. On the morning of January 24, 1848, less than 2 weeks before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo would formally cede California to the United States, Marshall was inspecting the tail race of the nearly completed mill. The channel had been deepened by the previous night's rush of water, and in the shallow riverbed he noticed several small, gleaming flecks. He gathered the metallic particles, which were about the size of a flattened pea, and conducted a series of rudimentary tests. They were malleable, not brittle, and far heavier than ordinary pyrite. Convinced, but still uncertain, Marshall rode the 50 miles to Sutter's Fort. In secrecy, the 2 men consulted an encyclopedia and performed further tests, confirming the substance was gold. Both immediately grasped the catastrophic implications for Sutter's vision of an agricultural fiefdom. A gold rush would bring hordes of prospectors who would overrun his lands, trample his crops, and scatter his workforce. They agreed to keep the discovery a secret. Such a monumental secret, however, was impossible to contain. The workers at the mill, both Mormon veterans of the Mexican-American War and local natives, soon made their own discoveries in the riverbed. The news began to spread, first as a whisper among the scattered ranches and settlements of the interior. The decisive moment that transformed local rumor into a full-blown mania came from Samuel Brannan, a shrewd Mormon elder and entrepreneur in San Francisco. After establishing a well-stocked supply store near Sutter's Fort, Brannan returned to the port town. On a day in May 1848, he walked through the streets, waving a bottle filled with gold dust and shouting, "Gold, gold, gold from the American River." His public confirmation was the spark. San Francisco, a town of only a few hundred people, emptied out almost overnight as clerks, soldiers, and laborers abandoned their posts and headed for the hills. The news carried by ships leaving the bay began its slow journey to the East Coast and the world. igniting the fuse for what would become the largest mass migration in American history. The whispers of gold became a global roar, following President James K. Polk's official confirmation to Congress in December of 1848. This federal endorsement legitimized the rumors and triggered an unprecedented international movement of people. The prospectors who descended upon California in 1849, forever known as the 49ers, came from every corner of the globe, creating a demographic explosion that was as sudden as it was chaotic. They traveled by three main routes, each a formidable undertaking. The overland journey across the American continent via the California Trail was a grueling 6-month ordeal covering 2,000 miles. Emigrants in wagon trains faced the constant threats of cholera, which killed thousands, along with accidental gunshots, drownings at river crossings, and the ever-present danger of starvation if supplies ran out. A second route involved a sea voyage of some 18,000 nautical miles around Cape Horn. This journey could take 5 to 8 months, a monotonous and dangerous passage through storms and doldrums, where scurvy and other shipboard diseases were rampant. The third and fastest route was a shortcut through the Isthmus of Panama. Travelers would take a ship to the Atlantic side, traverse the isthmus by dugout canoe and mule through dense, disease-ridden jungle, and then wait, often for weeks or months, for a ship on the Pacific side to complete the journey. This path exposed them to yellow fever and malaria, which claimed many lives. This torrent of humanity funneled directly into the port of San Francisco, transforming it almost instantly. In early 1848, the village was a sleepy outpost of fewer than 1,000 residents. By the end of 1849, it was a chaotic, sprawling city of more than 25,000. The physical town dissolved into a canvas and wood metropolis of tents, shanties, and prefabricated buildings hastily shipped from the East Coast. Streets became impassable quagmires of mud, sand, and refuse. The harbour became a forest of masts, as hundreds of ships were abandoned by their crews who deserted en masse for the goldfields. Many of these vessels were simply scuttled or dragged ashore to be used as warehouses, hotels, and even jails, their hulks forming the foundations of the expanding city. There was no effective government, no sanitation system, and no established law enforcement, leading to a state of near anarchy. Hyperinflation gripped the economy. A single egg could cost the equivalent of a day's wages back east. San Francisco had become the de facto capital of the goldfields, a turbulent, transient, and utterly transformed gateway to fortune. The physical city that erupted on the shores of Yerba Buena Cove was a direct consequence of material scarcity meeting frantic demand. With no established sawmills, brick kilns, or stone quarries, traditional construction was an impossibility. The first wave of 49ers built a city from the materials at hand: canvas sails from abandoned ships, packing crates, and thin sheets of scrap lumber. This created a temporary metropolis, a landscape of flapping tents and flimsy shanties packed so densely that fire was a constant existential threat. The architecture was one of pure improvisation. Entrepreneurs imported prefabricated iron buildings from China and corrugated tin structures from Britain, which could be bolted together in a matter of days to serve as stores or hotels. Yerba Buena Cove itself became an accidental resource. By 1850, more than 500 vessels lay derelict in the harbour, a vast unintended supply depot. These abandoned ships were quickly repurposed. The Apollo and the Niantic were two of many that were dragged into the mudflats and converted into warehouses and grog shops, their sturdy hulls offering more security than any land-based structure. As the demand for solid ground intensified, a process of systematic landfill began. The city's numerous sand dunes were levelled, their contents used to fill in the shallow cove, burying the ship hulks and creating new real estate. This frantic expansion occurred without any municipal planning or oversight. Land speculation was rampant, with lots sold and resold daily at escalating prices, often before the land itself had even been created from the bay. The The city's energy was one of desperate, unregulated commerce. Gambling halls like the El Dorado, housed in massive tents, operated around the clock, their profits sometimes exceeding those of the gold mines. Every structure served a commercial purpose, with living quarters relegated to cramped back rooms or upper floors. The population was overwhelmingly male and transient, a churning mass of individuals focused solely on acquiring wealth. This environment, devoid of established social structures, families, or civic institutions, fostered a raw, transactional society where hope and desperation were commodities, traded with the same intensity as gold dust. The news of gold, carried by sea, reached Pacific ports long before it saturated the eastern United States. This accident of geography meant the first wave of international prospectors came not from the Anglo-American East, but from the South and West. Experienced miners from Sonora, Mexico, and Chile, possessed of mining skills honed over generations, were among the first to arrive in late 1848 and early 1849. They introduced sophisticated techniques previously unknown in the region, such as the use of the batey, a wooden bowl for panning, and the arrastra, a mule-powered mill for crushing quartz ore. Following them, prospectors from Peru, Australia, and the Hawaiian Islands joined the influx. From across the Pacific, the first significant groups of Chinese immigrants began to arrive, initially welcomed for their industrious labor. Europeans, reeling from the economic dislocations and political upheavals of the revolutions of 1848, also embarked for California. Germans, French, and Irish immigrants sought economic opportunity and an escape from the rigid social hierarchies of the Old World. This convergence made San Francisco the most ethnically diverse city in the world almost overnight. Streets were a polyglot confusion of languages, and neighborhoods began to form along national lines, with areas colloquially known as Little Chile, Frenchtown, and the beginnings of Chinatown. This initial cosmopolitanism, however, proved fragile. As surface gold became more difficult to find, competition in the goldfields intensified, and tolerance gave way to virulent nativism. Anglo-American miners, imbued with the ideology of manifest destiny, began to view foreign prospectors not as fellow fortune seekers, but as competitors stealing American wealth. This resentment was codified into law. In 1850, the California legislature passed the foreign miners' tax, a prohibitive monthly fee levied almost exclusively on Latin American and Chinese miners. The law was less a revenue measure than an instrument of economic expulsion. Its enforcement was often brutal, leading to claim jumping, violence, and the forced displacement of thousands of non-Anglo miners from the most profitable diggings. Lynchings and mob violence became common tactics to drive out competition. This early conflict established a foundational tension within San Francisco's identity, creating a society that was simultaneously a global crossroads and a crucible of racial and ethnic strife, a pattern that would define the city's social fabric for the next century. The rapid, unplanned urbanization of San Francisco created a vacuum of civic authority. The institutions of American law courts, police, and municipal government were established in name only, utterly unequipped to manage the sheer volume of transient humanity and the immense wealth flowing through the city. This institutional failure allowed for the rise of organized crime. Criminal gangs, largely composed of ex-convicts from the British penal colonies in Australia known as the Sydney Ducks, established a foothold. They controlled the city's northern waterfront, a district that became notorious as the Barbary Coast. This area was not merely a zone of vice, it was the epicenter of a criminal economy based on robbery, electoral fraud, and the practice of crimping or shanghaiing, where sailors were drugged or beaten and forced into service on outbound ships. The official government was powerless and often complicit. Political machines, intertwined with the gambling and saloon interests, ensured that law enforcement was selective and that courts were staffed by corruptible officials. In response to this systemic collapse, a powerful faction of the city's merchant class organized the first committee of vigilance in 1851. Led by prominent figures like merchant Sam Brannan, this was not a spontaneous mob, but a structured, extra-legal organization with a formal constitution and a defined mission. To do the work the government would not. The committee held secret trials, and its verdicts were swift and final. Suspects were interrogated, and if found guilty, were either deported on the next available ship or, in the most serious cases, publicly hanged from makeshift gallows. After executing 4 men and banishing some 30 others, the 1851 committee disbanded, having temporarily suppressed the worst of the lawlessness. However, the underlying corruption festered, leading to the formation of a second, far more powerful committee of vigilance in 1856, following the murder of crusading newspaper editor James King of William by a corrupt politician. This new committee was a de facto revolutionary government, thousands of members strong, armed and organized into military-style companies. They seized state militia armories, arrested elected officials, and conducted public executions, effectively running the city for 3 months. This period established a precedent of frontier justice, a direct and violent form of civic action that demonstrated a deep-seated public belief that when formal law fails, order must be imposed by other means. The Gold Rush city was built to burn. Densely packed structures of wood, canvas, and tar paper, combined with the fierce winds sweeping in from the bay, created a landscape of extreme flammability. With no organized water system and only rudimentary volunteer-based fire brigades, San Francisco was a recurring catastrophe waiting to happen. Between December 1849 and June 1851, it happened 6 times. This series of conflagrations, known as the Great Fires, became a defining, formative cycle in the city's early history. Each fire was a lesson in the impermanence of the makeshift city. The first, on Christmas Eve of 1849, consumed the area around Portsmouth Square, destroying 50 buildings and causing over $1 million in damage. It was followed by even more destructive fires in May and June of 1850. The most devastating of the series, the Great Fire of May 4, 1851, obliterated 18 city blocks and reduced the entire central business district to ash. The economic toll was staggering, estimated at over $12 million, wiping out the fortunes of countless merchants and speculators in a matter of hours. Yet the response to each disaster was immediate and uniform. Rebuilding did not wait for the embers to cool. Property owners, driven by the relentless pace of gold rush commerce, would often begin framing new structures atop the still hot rubble of the old. This cycle of destruction and reconstruction fundamentally altered the city's physical character. After each fire, there was a concerted push for more permanent building materials. The demand for brick and stone skyrocketed, leading to the construction of more substantial fire-resistant buildings. Business owners began installing heavy iron shutters and doors on their new structures, hoping to create fireproof vaults for their goods. This process also accelerated the filling of Yerba Buena Cove, as the debris from burned buildings was simply pushed into the bay to create new land. Concurrently, the fires spurred the development of civic infrastructure. A formal, if still volunteer, fire department was organized, with competing companies that became powerful social and political forces. Cisterns were built beneath major intersections to hold water for firefighting. This relentless cycle forged a city defined by a stubborn, speculative resilience, where fortunes lost in the morning were pursued again in the afternoon, and the constant threat of annihilation only accelerated the drive to build something more solid and lasting. In the initial years of the gold rush, San Francisco's economy operated on a foundation of raw metal. Gold dust, weighed in pinches and pouches, was the primary medium of exchange. This system was rife with inefficiency and fraud. Transactions were slow, measurements were inconsistent, and merchants often used weighted scales, cynically known as honest miners' scales, to their advantage. The absence of a standardized currency hampered the transition from a frontier boomtown to a stable commercial center. The first attempts at order came from the private sector. Dozens of private assayers and minters, such as Moffat Co. and Wass, Molitor Co., began producing their own coins and ingots. These privately minted pieces, stamped with their weight and fineness, were more reliable than raw dust, but lacked the full faith of a government-backed currency. Their value fluctuated, and they were often refused by international merchants, creating a persistent drag on large-scale commerce. The city's business leaders understood that for San Francisco to become a true financial capital, it needed a federal mint. After intense lobbying, Congress authorized a branch mint, which opened its doors in 1854. Its immediate task was to convert the chaotic stream of raw gold from the Sierra Nevada into official, standardized United States coinage. The mint's output was immediate and transformative, injecting millions of dollars in reliable, government-guaranteed currency into the Western economy. This monetary stability was the bedrock upon which a true financial ecosystem could be built. Banks, which had previously operated as little more than secure depositories for gold dust, could now engage in more complex financial activities. One figure epitomized this transformation: William C. Ralston. Arriving in 1854, Ralston possessed a vision that extended far beyond the goldfields. In 1864, he co-founded the Bank of California, an institution that would become the dominant financial power in the American West. Ralston used the bank's capital not just to finance mining, but to build the infrastructure of a modern state. He invested heavily in the silver mines of the Comstock Lode in Nevada, using the immense profits to fund railroads, steamship lines, manufacturing, and grand civic projects in San Francisco. He transformed the city from a place where wealth was simply extracted into a center where capital was actively managed and deployed, laying the financial foundation for its future as the undisputed economic hub of the Pacific Coast. Just as the placer gold of the Sierra Nevada began to dwindle, a new and far greater mineral discovery in 1859 ensured San Francisco's continued economic dominance. In the arid Virginia range of what would soon become Nevada, prospectors searching for gold were frustrated by a heavy, blue-gray mud that clogged their equipment. This troublesome substance was dismissed as waste until an assay revealed it to be silver sulfide of an astonishing purity. This was the discovery of the Comstock Lode, a vast, deep vein of silver and gold ore that would prove to be the richest mineral strike in American history. The Comstock was fundamentally different from the California gold rush. It required industrial-scale operations, massive capital investment, and advanced engineering to extract wealth from deep underground. San Francisco, with its established banks, foundries, and the new stock exchange, was perfectly positioned to become the financial and logistical heart of this new boom. Capital and machinery flowed east from the city to Virginia City, while an unprecedented river of silver flowed west, transforming San Francisco's economy. From this flood of Nevada silver, a new class of plutocrats emerged: the Silver Kings. The most powerful were four Irish-American partners known as the Bonanza Firm: John Mackay, James Fair, James Flood, and William O'Brien. Through a combination of technical expertise, ruthless business tactics, and control of the Bank of Nevada, they consolidated claims and, in 1873, uncovered the Big Bonanza, a concentration of ore so immense it defied belief. The wealth they extracted was almost incomprehensible, making them among the richest men in the world. This new fortune was not kept in Nevada. It was spent and invested in San Francisco. The Silver Kings reshaped the city's physical and social landscape, building palatial mansions atop Nob Hill that announced their arrival as a new American aristocracy. They diversified their holdings, pouring millions into real estate, railroads, and shipping lines, financing the city's transition from a gold rush port into a Gilded Age metropolis. The Comstock Lode, therefore, did more than just enrich a few men. It provided the immense capital that fueled San Francisco's second and more permanent wave of creation. While the Silver Kings were reshaping San Francisco with Nevada's mineral wealth, a different kind of empire was being forged, one built not on ore, but on iron rails and political influence. The architects of this empire were four Sacramento merchants, known to history as the Big Four: Leland Stanford, a grocer and future governor; Collis P. Huntington and Mark Hopkins, partners in a hardware store; and Charles Crocker, a dry goods merchant. They were not railroad engineers or financiers, but pragmatic businessmen who recognized that California's isolation from the rest of the nation was both a vulnerability and an immense commercial opportunity. Their vision was to control the creation of a transcontinental railroad, a project that would give them absolute dominion over the movement of goods and people into and out of the state. In 1861, they incorporated the Central Pacific Railroad Company. Their timing was politically astute. With the southern states seceding from the Union, the long-standing political opposition to a northern rail route vanished. The Big Four, led by Huntington's relentless lobbying in Washington, D.C., secured the passage of the Pacific Railway Act of 1862. This legislation provided the Central Pacific with a crucial foundation of federal support. Government bonds issued per mile of track laid and vast grants of public land on either side of the right-of-way. This federal backing, combined with their own capital and state subsidies, allowed them to begin the monumental task of building eastward from Sacramento, battling the formidable granite barrier of the Sierra Nevada. The construction was a feat of engineering and brutal labor, largely carried out by thousands of Chinese workers. Upon the completion of the transcontinental line in 1869, the Big Four did not rest. They immediately began to consolidate their power. Through a new holding company, the Southern Pacific, they methodically bought out, bankrupted, or built competing rail lines throughout California. They acquired control of the state's major ports, steamship companies, and ferry services. By the 1880s, their enterprise had become a near-total monopoly, an entity so powerful and pervasive that it effectively controlled the state's economy and legislature, earning the infamous nickname the Octopus for its far-reaching tentacles. The construction of the Central Pacific Railroad was one of the most demanding engineering and logistical undertakings of the 19th century. The primary obstacle was the Sierra Nevada, a 70-foot wall of solid granite. To conquer it, Charles Crocker, who managed construction, required a massive and stable labor force. He initially struggled, as the white laborers he hired were unreliable, often abandoning the hard, dangerous work for the promise of the Nevada silver mines. In 1865, against significant opposition, Crocker began hiring Chinese immigrants. By 1867, they constituted over 90% of the workforce, numbering more than 10,000. Organized into disciplined gangs, these workers proved to be exceptionally efficient and resilient. They were tasked with the Herculean labor of carving a level grade through the mountains. Using hand drills, pickaxes, and black powder, they chipped away at the granite. To speed progress through the most formidable sections, they began using the highly unstable new explosive nitroglycerin. Workers were lowered down sheer cliffs in baskets to drill holes and place charges, a task with an appallingly high mortality rate from accidental explosions and winter avalanches. Over the course of 4 years, they blasted 15 tunnels through the granite peaks, including the 659-foot summit tunnel at Donner Pass. As the Central Pacific pushed east, the Union Pacific Railroad was building west from Omaha, Nebraska, employing a workforce composed largely of Irish immigrants and Civil War veterans. The two companies were engaged in a frantic race, spurred on by the federal bonds and land grants awarded for each mile of track completed. Once clear of the Sierras, the Central Pacific crews set extraordinary records for track laying across the Nevada and Utah deserts, at one point laying over 10 miles of track in a single day. The two lines finally met at Promontory Summit, Utah. On May 10, 1869, Leland Stanford of the Central Pacific and Thomas Durant of the Union Pacific tapped a ceremonial golden spike into a pre-drilled hole in a laurelwood tie, and a telegraph message flashed across the nation: done. In an instant, a journey that had once taken months by sea or wagon was reduced to a single week, irrevocably binding California to the rest of the country. The immense fortunes generated by the railroad monopoly and the Comstock Lode required a physical expression, a landscape upon which the new plutocracy could display its power. They found it on the steep slopes of the California Street Hill, a commanding promontory that would soon be rechristened Nob Hill, a colloquialism for the nobs or nabobs who settled there. This was to be a citadel of the elite, a residential enclave built to dominate the city's skyline and announce a new social order. Leland Stanford was the first of the Big Four to build, commencing construction in 1874 on a palatial residence that would ultimately cost $2 million. It was a monument of the Gilded Age, featuring 50 rooms, an immense central rotunda of mosaics and stained glass, and its own art gallery. His neighbour, Mark Hopkins, soon followed, erecting a fantastical wooden castle of spires, towers and gables, so ornate and complex that it became a landmark of architectural excess. Not to be outdone, Charles Crocker acquired an entire city block and built a vast Italianate mansion next to a 40-foot-tall spite fence, constructed solely to block the light of a neighbour who had refused to sell his property. The Silver Kings also staked their claims. James Flood's mansion was a Baroque masterpiece of brownstone, while James Fair built a towering, narrow residence next door. These were not merely homes, they were declarations of dynastic ambition, constructed with imported hardwoods, European marble, and armies of craftsmen. The interiors were filled with priceless art, custom furniture, and elaborate gas lighting systems. To ascend the steep grade, the residents financed the construction of the California Street Cable Railroad in 1878, effectively making their exclusive neighborhood accessible only to those who could afford the fare. This deliberate act of urban engineering solidified the hill's isolation and prestige. The opulence of Nob Hill stood in stark, deliberate contrast to the crowded tenements of the working-class neighborhoods below, serving as a daily, visible reminder of the profound social and economic stratification that now defined San Francisco. It was the physical embodiment of a new, ruthless aristocracy built on mineral wealth and monopoly power. Below the opulent mansions of Nob Hill, a different reality was taking shape. The national economic depression of the 1870s hit San Francisco with particular ferocity. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, once a symbol of progress, had flooded the city with unemployed laborers, creating a desperate and volatile surplus of workers. Wages plummeted, and for the thousands living in crowded tenements south of Market Street, life was defined by long hours, hazardous working conditions, and the constant insecurity of employment. This widespread economic anxiety found a convenient and tragic scapegoat: the city's Chinese immigrants. Having provided the essential labor that built the railroad, they were now vilified as the source of the city's economic woes, accused of depressing wages and taking jobs from white workers. In July of 1877, these simmering tensions exploded. At a vacant lot near City Hall, known as the Sandlots, an Irish drayman named Dennis Kearney began delivering fiery, xenophobic speeches to massive crowds of unemployed men. His slogan, "The Chinese must go," became the rallying cry of the newly formed Working Men's Party of California. Kearney's rhetoric ignited a wave of violence. For several nights, mobs surged through the city, attacking and burning Chinese laundries, businesses, and homes, leading to the deaths of several residents. The official police force was overwhelmed. In response, a citizens' militia, the Pick-Handle Brigade, was organized by prominent figures to restore order through force. The Sandlot riots marked a turning point. While the immediate violence was suppressed, the political movement it spawned grew in power. The Working Men's Party successfully channeled the anger of the white working class into a formidable political force, winning a third of the seats to the state's 1,878 Constitutional Convention. The resulting Constitution of 1,879 was deeply shaped by their influence, containing numerous provisions that explicitly discriminated against Chinese residents. From this crucible of conflict, San Francisco's modern labor movement was born. Powerful unions, particularly in the maritime trades, began to organize, fighting for better wages and conditions. The city became a bastion of organized labor, a political landscape where the clash between capital and the working class would define its identity for decades to come. The violent agitations of the 1870s coalesced into a potent and organized political movement that fundamentally altered state and national policy. The Working Men's Party of California, under Dennis Carney's charismatic leadership, successfully translated street-level anger into electoral power. Their platform was built almost entirely upon a foundation of virulent anti-Chinese sentiment, which they skillfully linked to the legitimate economic grievances of the white laboring class. This movement was not a fringe element. It captured a significant portion of the California electorate, sending delegates to the state's second constitutional convention in 1878. The resulting California Constitution of 1879 was a document deeply imbued with their xenophobic agenda, containing an entire article titled Chinese, which barred corporations from employing Chinese individuals and authorized cities to remove them to designated areas. While many of these state-level provisions were later struck down by federal courts as violations of treaties and the U.S. Constitution, their passage demonstrated the political force of the anti-Chinese movement. The pressure from California soon became a national issue. As a crucial swing state in presidential elections, California's political demands carried disproportionate weight in Washington, D.C. Both the Republican and Democratic parties, vying for the state's electoral votes, began to adopt anti-Chinese planks in their national platforms. The issue was no longer one of local prejudice, but of national political expediency. In 1882, this sustained political pressure culminated in a landmark piece of federal legislation. Congress passed, and President Chester A. Arthur signed, the Chinese Exclusion Act. This was the first law in American history to explicitly restrict immigration based on race and nationality. The act placed a 10-year moratorium on the immigration of all Chinese laborers into the United States. It was devastatingly effective, not only in halting new arrivals, but also in its impact on the Chinese already in the country. The law explicitly barred all Chinese immigrants from becoming naturalized citizens, permanently branding them as outsiders in their adopted home. The act was renewed in 1892 by the Geary Act, and in 1902, the exclusion was made permanent. For the Chinese community in San Francisco, the act institutionalized their status as a vilified and legally vulnerable minority, severing family ties and casting a long shadow of official discrimination over the city. Faced with systemic hostility and legal segregation, the Chinese community in San Francisco did not simply endure, it organized. Barred from participating in the city's civic and economic life, residents created a complex, self-contained society within the crowded blocks of Chinatown. This parallel structure provided the social services, governance, and legal arbitration that the wider city denied them. The primary pillars of this internal order were the district associations, known as Haiguan. These organizations were formed based on an immigrant's place of origin in the Guangdong province of China, and they served as the fundamental support system for newcomers. They provided temporary housing, employment assistance, and mediation for business and personal disputes. Above these was the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, known to outsiders as the Chinese Six Companies, which acted as an unofficial government and the primary advocate for the community in its dealings with the hostile city around it. Alongside these legitimate institutions, a more shadowy power structure emerged in the form of the Tongs. Originally fraternal organizations or mutual aid societies, some Tongs evolved into powerful criminal syndicates. They controlled the neighborhood's illicit economies, including gambling parlors, opium dens, and prostitution, enterprises that thrived in the vacuum left by the city's neglect. For many residents, the Tongs offered a perilous form of protection and employment, an alternative to the poverty of the mainstream world. However, their influence was also a source of internal fear and violent conflict, as rival Tongs fought brutal street battles over control of territory and rackets. This insular world gave rise to persistent legends of a vast secret network of tunnels beneath the streets of Chinatown. While sensationalized accounts spoke of an entire subterranean city, the reality was more pragmatic. In response to constant police raids and the threat of mob violence, businesses and residences did create a series of interconnected basements, cellars, and hidden passageways. These were not elaborate tunnels, but practical modifications to existing structures designed to facilitate the rapid movement of people and goods, to provide escape routes, and to conceal illicit activities from the authorities. This semi-hidden world, born of necessity, was the physical manifestation of a community forced to live in the shadows, a resilient and intricate society built for survival beneath the surface of the city. The post-Civil War expansion of San Francisco was fundamentally constrained by its own geography. The city's development stalled at the base of its precipitous hills, which proved nearly insurmountable for the primary mode of urban transport, the horse-drawn streetcar. On the steepest grades, particularly in wet weather, the strain on the animals was immense, and the danger of catastrophic failure was constant. A solution to this topographical challenge came not from a transit expert, but from a Scottish-born wire rope manufacturer named Andrew Smith Halliday. His firm was a principal supplier of heavy-duty cable for the mining operations in the Sierra Nevada, where his products were used in suspension bridges and aerial tramways to haul ore. The engineering principle of using a stationary engine to move objects via a durable wire rope was one he understood intimately. The apocryphal story of Halliday witnessing a team of horses being dragged to their deaths after slipping on a steep, wet street served as the compassionate catalyst for an idea already grounded in his professional expertise. He envisioned a public transit system based on the same technology used in the mines. His concept was a mechanical marvel of integrated parts. A massive, stationary steam engine, housed in a central powerhouse, would turn large winding wheels that drove an endless loop of steel cable. This cable would run at a constant speed through a conduit, a narrow channel built just below the surface of the street. The cars themselves would be equipped with a powerful gripping device, a large lever-operated clamp that could be lowered through a slot in the street. To move, the car's operator, the gripman, would engage the lever, causing the grip to seize the constantly moving cable, pulling the car along. To stop, the gripman would release the cable and apply brakes. It was a system that completely divorced the car's movement from any onboard power source. After securing financing, Halliday prepared for the first public test of his Clay Street Hill Railroad. In the early morning hours of August 2, 1873, the first car was brought to the precipice of the Clay and Jones Street intersection. The gripman, hired for the run, reportedly took one look at the steep descent and refused to operate the vehicle. Halliday, confident in his engineering, took the controls himself and successfully piloted the car down the hill and back up again. The invention was an immediate and unqualified success, a purely mechanical solution that had tamed the city's terrain and would unlock the development of its highest hills for decades to come. As San Francisco solidified its urban core in the 1860s, a movement arose to create a grand public park, an amenity considered essential for any great American city. The land designated for this purpose, a tract of over 1,000 acres stretching to the Pacific Ocean, was not a pastoral landscape awaiting cultivation, but a barren expanse of windswept sand dunes known as the outside lands. The challenge was not one of landscape architecture, but of ecological engineering on a monumental scale. The project began in earnest in 1871 under the direction of the first park superintendent, William Hammond Hall. His initial surveys confirmed the primary obstacle. The sand itself was in constant motion, driven by relentless ocean winds that buried any nascent vegetation. Hall's plan was a multi-stage process of terraforming, beginning not with trees, but with stabilization. The first step was to sow fast-growing barley across the dunes. The barley's root system provided an initial temporary anchor. As the barley grew, it was ploughed under, adding the first organic matter to the sterile sand. Following the barley, workers planted native lupine, a hardy legume that had the critical ability to fix nitrogen, further enriching the developing topsoil. The true breakthrough, however, was the importation and widespread planting of Ammophila arenaria, a European beach grass whose dense, deep root network proved exceptionally effective at binding the sand and halting its movement. Only after this foundational stability was achieved could the planting of a forest begin. The logistical effort was immense. Hundreds of thousands of tons of manure, collected from the city's stables, were transported to the dunes to serve as fertilizer. John McLaren, who took over as superintendent in 1887 and would oversee the park for the next 5 decades, directed the planting of a windbreak of Monterey cypress and Monterey pine along the park's western edge. Behind this protective barrier, more than 1 million trees, primarily the fast-growing blue gum eucalyptus from Australia, were planted over the ensuing years. To sustain this artificial ecosystem, an extensive irrigation network was required. A system of windmills was constructed to pump vast quantities of groundwater, which was then distributed throughout the park. This was not a beautification project. It was a decades-long, systematic reclamation of an inhospitable landscape, a deliberate and scientifically grounded transformation of desert into a cultivated oasis. At the turn of the 20th century, San Francisco's government fell under the control of a political machine that systematized corruption on an industrial scale. The vehicle for this takeover was the Union Labor Party, a political entity born from the city's powerful labor movement, but which was quickly co-opted. The architect of the machine was Abraham Roof, a highly intelligent and politically astute lawyer who never held a major elected office himself, but operated as the city's absolute boss. His public face was Mayor Eugene Schmitz, a handsome and charismatic orchestra leader with no political experience, making him the perfect, pliable frontman. Together, they established a system of graft that was both remarkably simple and brazenly comprehensive. Roof's law office became the de facto clearinghouse for all municipal business. Corporations seeking valuable city franchises for streetcar lines, telephone service, or gas utilities did not bribe officials directly. Instead, they paid exorbitant legal fees to Roof for his services. A portion of these funds would then be discreetly distributed by Roof to Mayor Schmitz and the city's Board of Supervisors, nearly all of whom were under his control, to guarantee the necessary votes and ordinances. The system extended beyond corporate interests to the city's vice economy. Brothels, gambling houses, and illicit prize-fighting promoters paid for protection from police raids through the same mechanism. The most notorious of these arrangements involved the city's French restaurants, which were in reality high-class brothels that operated with impunity by paying set fees to the machine. This era of systemic corruption prompted a backlash from a coalition of reformers. Led by Fremont Older, the crusading editor of the San Francisco Bulletin, and financed by wealthy businessman Rudolph Spreckels, a formal investigation was launched. The prosecution was headed by Francis Haney, a relentless federal prosecutor, and his deputy, Hiram Johnson. The subsequent graft trials, beginning in 1906, became a national spectacle. The proceedings were marked by high drama, including the courtroom shooting of Henney by a prospective juror and the bombing of a key witness's home. In the end, the results were mixed. Mayor Schmitz was convicted, but his conviction was overturned on a legal technicality. The wealthy businessmen who paid the bribes largely escaped punishment. Only Abraham Roof, the brilliant architect of the entire system, was successfully prosecuted and sent to San Quentin prison. the sole major figure to be held accountable for an era of corruption that had permeated every level of City Hall. In the decades following the Civil War, San Francisco cultivated a civic identity that consciously diverged from its rough-and-tumble origins, aspiring to a level of cultural sophistication that earned it the title Paris of the West. This transformation was financed by the immense fortunes generated from Nevada silver and the Central Pacific Railroad, which were quickly reinvested into institutions of high culture. The city's commitment to the performing arts was manifested in the construction of opulent venues. The California Theatre, opened in 1869 by banking magnate William Ralston, was a lavish showplace that brought the world's leading theatrical talents, such as actor Edwin Booth, to the Pacific coast. It was soon surpassed by the Grand Opera House in 1873, a monumental structure that could seat over 2,000 patrons and which regularly hosted touring European opera companies. The presence of such venues established the city as a mandatory stop on the international performance circuit, exposing its populace to a level of artistic production previously found only in the great capitals of the East Coast and Europe. Parallel to this formal cultural development, a distinct literary and bohemian scene emerged. Writers like Bret Harte, who edited the Overland Monthly, and a young Samuel Clemens, writing under the name Mark Twain for local newspapers, helped forge a uniquely Western American literary voice. They were joined by figures like Ambrose Bierce and Jack London, who chronicled the city's life from its saloons to its drawing rooms. This intellectual ferment was institutionalized with the founding of the Bohemian Club in 1872, an association initially for journalists that soon expanded to include artists, musicians, and the wealthy patrons who supported them. It became the nexus of the city's creative and financial elite, a place where business was conducted alongside artistic debate. The visual arts also found institutional support through the establishment of the San Francisco Art Association in 1871, which soon opened a school of design that would evolve into the San Francisco Art Institute. This provided formal training for a generation of artists who turned their focus to capturing the grand landscapes of the West, creating a regional artistic identity separate from the European traditions that dominated the art world. This combination of world-class performance venues, a self-aware literary movement, and a developing art scene cemented San Francisco's reputation not merely as a center of commerce, but as a capital of creativity and refined taste. At 5 on the morning of April 18, 1906, the city of San Francisco was largely asleep. In that moment of pre-dawn quiet, a geological event of immense scale initiated deep within the Earth's crust. A powerful foreshock, lasting about 20 seconds, served as the first warning. It was followed, almost immediately, by the cataclysmic main shock. The cause was a massive rupture along a 296-mile segment of the San Andreas Fault, a tectonic boundary that had been accumulating strain for decades. The epicenter was located just offshore of the city, and the energy released was directed with devastating efficiency into the peninsula. For a period of 45 to 60 seconds, the ground did not merely tremble, it convulsed in violent rolling waves, with horizontal displacements measured in feet, not inches. The destruction wrought by the seismic waves was immediate and selective, dictated by the underlying geology and the methods of construction. The most catastrophic failures occurred in the areas built upon made-ground landfill, created by leveling sand dunes and filling in the shallow waters of Yerba Buena Cove. In these districts, particularly the working-class neighborhoods south of Market, the soil underwent liquefaction, losing its structural integrity and behaving like a fluid. Multi-story brick hotels and tenements, built without steel reinforcement, disintegrated into piles of rubble, trapping thousands of residents. The city's new, supposedly earthquake-proof City Hall, a monument to the Gilded Age that had cost millions and taken decades to build, suffered a spectacular collapse. Its massive stone dome was stripped of its masonry, leaving only a skeletal steel frame, a stark symbol of the quake's power over human ambition. Elsewhere, the performance of structures varied. Well-constructed Victorian wood frame houses, capable of flexing with the ground's motion, often survived the shaking, though many were thrown from their foundations. The city's nascent collection of steel frame high-rises also proved resilient to the shock itself. The most critical damage, however, occurred underground. The violent earth motion shattered the city's brittle cast-iron water mains, crippling the entire system designed to fight fires. Simultaneously, hundreds of broken gas lines began to leak, releasing flammable fuel into the ruins. As the shaking subsided, the initial catastrophe of structural collapse was already giving way to the secondary, and ultimately more destructive, disaster of fire. In the immediate aftermath of the seismic shock, San Francisco's destruction began its second phase. The primary threat was no longer the moving earth, but the ignition of countless small fires. These blazes originated from mundane household sources: overturned wood and coal stoves from residents preparing breakfast, fractured chimneys spilling hot embers into wooden walls, and downed electrical lines arcing against flammable debris. One of the most significant early fires, which would later be known as the Ham and Eggs Fire, started when a woman in the Hayes Valley neighborhood lit her stove to cook a meal, unaware that the chimney had been damaged, igniting the structure. This was one of over 50 separate fires reported within the first hour. The San Francisco Fire Department, despite being a well-equipped and experienced force, was rendered almost completely ineffective from the outset. Its leader, Fire Chief Dennis T. Sullivan, was mortally wounded when a chimney from an adjacent building collapsed into his firehouse residence. More critically, the earthquake had crippled the city's water supply system. Responding engine companies would attach their hoses to hydrants, only to find them dry, the result of thousands of breaks in the underground cast-iron mains. Lacking water, the firefighters were reduced to bystanders as small, manageable fires began to merge. A steady wind pushed the growing conflagrations eastward from the working-class districts, consolidating them into an enormous, unified firefront. This created a firestorm, a blaze so large and intense that it generated its own wind system, pulling in oxygen from all directions and creating superheated drafts that could leap entire city blocks. By midday, the commercial and financial heart of the city was engulfed. In a desperate and ultimately flawed attempt to contain the inferno, civil and military authorities, under the command of General Frederick Funston at the Presidio, resorted to dynamiting buildings to create firebreaks. This strategy was executed by soldiers and untrained volunteers who often used excessive amounts of explosives. Rather than containing the blaze, the detonations frequently scattered burning embers onto adjacent rooftops, starting new fires ahead of the main front. For 3 days and nights, the fire burned, consuming everything in its path. It advanced through the city's most densely packed neighborhoods, destroying the grand hotels of Market Street, the mansions of Nob Hill that had survived the quake, and the entirety of Chinatown. The inferno was finally stopped by a combination of factors: the natural firebreak provided by the wide expanse of Van Ness Avenue, a shift in wind direction, and a final, desperate stand by firefighters who managed to pump salt water from the bay. By the morning of April 21st, the flames had subsided, leaving over 4 square miles of the city as a smouldering, desolate ruin. When the last fires were extinguished on the morning of April 21st, the full scope of San Francisco's obliteration was revealed. The conflagration had incinerated the urban core, leaving a ruin that stretched over 4.5 square miles, encompassing 514 city blocks. More than 28,000 buildings had been consumed, turning a modern American metropolis into a landscape of skeletal steel frames, lone brick chimneys, and endless fields of ash and rubble. The financial, commercial, and residential heart of the city had ceased to exist. The immediate consequence of this physical destruction was a humanitarian crisis of unprecedented scale. The disaster displaced a vast portion of the city's population, estimated at over 250,000 people, leaving them without shelter, food, or possessions. In the days that followed, A mass exodus occurred as the homeless population moved westward, away from the smouldering ruins, and into the unburned residential district. The city's public spaces were transformed into sprawling encampments. The largest of these impromptu settlements emerged in Golden Gate Park, where tens of thousands of refugees constructed makeshift shelters from salvaged lumber, scrap metal, and canvas. Other camps sprang up in the Presidio military reservation and on any available open ground. The U.S. Army, under General Funston's command, played a pivotal role in managing this crisis. Martial law, though never formally declared by the mayor, was effectively in place. Soldiers patrolled the streets to prevent looting and were tasked with the enormous logistical challenge of providing for the displaced populace. They established food distribution lines, known as bread lines, which became a defining feature of daily life for the survivors. The military also oversaw the construction of more organized refugee camps, laying out streets, and erecting thousands of standardized tents provided by the government. Sanitation was a paramount concern. The army dug latrines and enforced strict hygiene rules to prevent the outbreak of epidemic diseases like typhoid, a constant threat in the crowded and primitive conditions of the camps. Relief efforts were monumental, with aid pouring in from across the nation and the world. The Southern Pacific Railroad, controlled by the same men who had dominated the city's Gilded Age, transported supplies into the region free of charge. The immediate challenges were immense, providing sustenance for a population the size of a major city, establishing a system of communication in the absence of telegraph lines, and beginning the process of accounting for the dead, a number that was initially underestimated but is now believed to be over 3,000. In these first few days, San Francisco was no longer a city of buildings, but a city of survivors, living in parks and public squares, entirely dependent on organized relief for their existence. With the civilian government in disarray, and the San Francisco Police Department overwhelmed and scattered, a critical power vacuum emerged in the ruined city. The immediate and overwhelming fear among the propertied classes was that the disaster would unleash widespread anarchy and looting. In response to this perceived threat, a swift and brutal form of order was imposed, not by civil authorities, but by the United States Army. General Frederick Funston, the commander of the Department of California stationed at the Presidio, acted decisively without waiting for authorization from Washington. He deployed federal troops throughout the city, establishing patrols and checkpoints to secure what remained of the financial district and to guard against civil unrest. This military presence was given a veneer of civil legality on the afternoon of April 18th, when Mayor Eugene Schmitz, at the urging of a self-appointed committee of 50 composed of prominent citizens, issued a now infamous proclamation. It declared that federal troops and all deputized police officers were authorized to kill any and all persons found engaged in looting or in the commission of any other crime. This shoot-to-kill order effectively suspended habeas corpus and due process. It was a direct response to the perceived failure of the formal legal system in a moment of extreme crisis, empowering soldiers to act as judge, jury, and executioner. The implementation of this edict was immediate and harsh. Troops, some of whom were regular soldiers and others hastily deputized militia members, enforced the command with lethal force. Accounts from the period are filled with reports of individuals being shot on sight for attempting to retrieve possessions from their own ruined homes, actions mistaken for looting. The line between safeguarding property and summary execution became dangerously blurred. While the exact number of people killed under this order is impossible to verify, historical estimates suggest dozens, and perhaps hundreds, fell victim to this form of frontier justice. The military's role extended beyond preventing theft. Soldiers established a rigid system of control over the population, issuing passes required for movement between different districts of the city and enforcing a strict curfew. They were instrumental in the forced evacuation of areas deemed unsafe and took control of all relief supplies, managing their distribution to prevent hoarding and ensure a semblance of equity. This imposition of military authority was a double-edged sword. It successfully prevented the complete breakdown of social order that many had feared, but it did so at the cost of civil liberties. establishing a precedent of extrajudicial force that remains one of the disaster's most controversial legacies. In the aftermath of the Great Fire, San Francisco's formal economy was paralyzed. The city's major financial institutions, the bastions of Gilded Age wealth, were destroyed. Their massive vaults, though largely fireproof, were intensely hot, with bankers estimating it would take weeks for them to cool sufficiently to be opened without the risk of the contents incinerating upon contact with oxygen. This financial vacuum threatened to stall any rebuilding effort before it could begin, as credit and capital were locked away. However, one banker had acted with foresight. Amedeo Pietro Giannini, the founder of the fledgling Bank of Italy, had established his institution on a novel principle, serving the financial needs of immigrants and working-class citizens who were largely ignored by the established banks. On the morning of the earthquake, realizing the fire would eventually reach the financial district, Giannini raced to his bank. He loaded the institution's crucial assets, approximately $2 million in gold, coin, and negotiable securities, onto 2 horse-drawn wagons, concealing the money under crates of produce. He then transported the entire liquid wealth of his bank to his home in San Mateo, far from the approaching conflagration. While his competitors waited for their vaults to cool, Giannini returned to the city. Near the still busy waterfront at Washington Street Wharf, he established a new base of operations. His setup was a plank of wood placed over 2 barrels, a makeshift desk amidst the chaos. From this post, displaying a sign that read, "Bank of Italy, open for business," he began to lend. His criteria were revolutionary for the time. With all property records and deeds destroyed in the City Hall fire, traditional collateral was non-existent. Giannini extended loans based on the reputation of the borrower and the viability of their rebuilding proposals. He relied on handshakes and his deep knowledge of the city's working-class communities. He provided capital to small merchants, contractors, and families, enabling them to purchase lumber and supplies to begin the reconstruction of their homes and businesses. This rapid injection of liquidity into the grassroots economy was a critical catalyst for the city's recovery. The established banks, when they finally opened, were cautious and slow to lend, focused on their wealthy clientele. Giannini's Bank of Italy, however, financed the small-scale efforts that began the city's rebirth from the ground up. This act of audacity and trust not only cemented Giannini's reputation, but also positioned his institution for unprecedented growth, evolving from this barrelhead on the docks into the financial giant that would one day be known as the Bank of America. Even before the last embers had cooled, a powerful civic determination asserted itself, captured in the ubiquitous slogan, "The damnedest, finest ruins." This was not a mood of despair, but of defiant optimism. The destruction was seen not as an end, but as a tabula rasa, a rare opportunity to correct the haphazard growth of the gold rush era and build a truly modern city. Fortuitously, a comprehensive plan for just such a transformation already existed. 1 year prior, the city's elite had commissioned the nation's preeminent urban planner, Daniel Burnham, the architect of the Chicago World's Fair, to create a new vision for San Francisco. Burnham's 1905 plan was a masterpiece of the City Beautiful movement, envisioning a metropolis of Parisian grandeur. It proposed replacing the rigid, hilly grid with a network of sweeping diagonal boulevards, grand civic plazas, and terraced parks. This design was aesthetically ambitious, intended to create a city of monumental vistas and efficient circulation. The earthquake and fire, in their destructive totality, seemed to have cleared the way for its implementation. A Committee on the Reconstruction of San Francisco was formed, championing Burnham's vision as the path forward. However, this ideal of a carefully planned, aesthetically pleasing city quickly collided with the hard realities of capitalism and property rights. The city's business leaders, merchants, and landowners had no patience for a multi-year process of replotting and eminent domain. Their immediate concern was the resumption of commerce. Rebuilding on their existing property lines, whose locations were being fiercely re-established amidst the rubble, was the fastest way to reopen for business. the legal and financial obstacles to Burnham's plan were insurmountable. With all municipal records destroyed, litigating thousands of individual property claims to create Burnham's boulevards would have mired the city in court for decades. Furthermore, the city was bankrupt, its tax base obliterated, making the cost of acquiring the necessary land prohibitive. The choice became one between a slow, beautiful, and orderly reconstruction, or a fast, chaotic, and profitable one. Pragmatism and private interest decisively won. The Burnham plan was quietly shelved. The reconstruction of San Francisco proceeded with astonishing speed, but it was a reconstruction of what had been. The old street grid was reimposed upon the ruins, forever locking the city into its challenging topography. The new downtown that emerged was built with more steel and stone, but it rose upon the same foundations and followed the same chaotic layout of the pre-disaster city. The Phoenix rose, but it did so on its own terms, shaped by the urgent demands of commerce rather than the grand designs of planners. To declare its complete recovery to the world, San Francisco conceived an event of breathtaking ambition. In 1911, it won the federal designation to host a World's Fair celebrating the completion of the Panama Canal, a monumental engineering feat that promised to reshape global trade. The Panama Pacific International Exposition of 1915 was designed to be more than a celebration of the canal. It was a carefully orchestrated performance of San Francisco's resurrection. The site itself was a testament to this transformative spirit. A vast 635-acre area of tidal marshland and mudflats known as Harbor View, located between the Presidio and Fort Mason, was filled and reclaimed to create a blank canvas for the fair. This act of creating land where there was once water mirrored the city's own act of creating a new urban core from rubble. The exposition was not built to last. Its grand palaces and courtyards were constructed from an ephemeral material called staff, a mixture of plaster and fibrous hemp applied over wooden frames. This allowed for rapid construction of immense, ornate structures that gave the illusion of ancient Roman and Greek permanence but were intended to be temporary. The architectural centerpiece was the 435-foot Tower of Jewels, a structure adorned with over 100,000 pieces of colored cut glass called novagems, which were backed with mirrors and faceted to shimmer in the sun and sparkle under the new technology of electric floodlights at night. The fair was a meticulously planned spectacle, a self-contained city of illusion. Its 8 main palaces were organized around a series of courts, such as the Court of the Universe and the Court of the Four Seasons. These buildings showcased international and domestic exhibits on fine arts, liberal arts, manufacturing, and transportation. It was a forward-looking event, featuring demonstrations of the transcontinental telephone call and aerial displays by early aviators like Lincoln Beechey. For 10 months, millions of visitors walked through the Jewel City, a potent symbol of American technological optimism and San Francisco's undeniable rebirth. Upon its closing, the temporary city was systematically dismantled, its grand palaces demolished as planned. Only one structure was saved by public demand: Bernard Maybeck's Palace of Fine Arts, left to stand as a permanent melancholic ruin and the sole physical remnant of the triumphant fair. As Europe descended into the Great War, San Francisco's strategic position on the Pacific transformed it into a critical hub for American industrial and military mobilization. The city's shipyards, particularly the massive Union Iron Works which had been acquired by Bethlehem Steel, underwent a period of explosive growth. Contracts from the U.S. Navy fueled a round-the-clock construction schedule, with thousands of workers pouring into the Potrero and Hunters Point districts to build destroyers, submarines, and transport ships. This wartime economic boom, however, occurred within a city deeply fractured by political dissent. San Francisco was a bastion of the American labor movement, and many of its most powerful unions were influenced by socialist and anarchist ideologies that were staunchly anti-war. This created a volatile atmosphere, pitting the city's business establishment and conservative civic groups against a militant working class. The tension found its focus in the preparedness movement, a nationwide campaign advocated by industrialists and politicians who believed the US must arm itself for inevitable entry into the conflict. On July 22, 1916, the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce organized a massive Preparedness Day parade to demonstrate public support for military expansion. The event was intended as a patriotic spectacle, but it became a stage for one of the most tragic and politically charged events in the city's history. As the parade moved down Market Street, a suitcase bomb, packed with metal slugs and concealed near the ferry building at Stewart Street, detonated in the crowd. The explosion killed 10 people and wounded 40 others, representing the deadliest act of terrorism in the United States up to that time. The city's establishment reacted with swift and targeted fury. Despite a near-total lack of evidence, blame was immediately directed at radical labor figures. Within days, 2 prominent labor organizers, Thomas Mooney and Warren Billings, were arrested, along with several associates. Their subsequent trials were a travesty of justice, built upon perjured testimony from witnesses who were later proven to be unreliable and coached by the prosecution. Mooney and Billings were convicted and sentenced to hang, though their sentences were later commuted to life imprisonment. The Preparedness Day bombing and the controversial convictions that followed became a national cause célèbre, exposing the deep, violent chasm that existed between capital and labor in wartime San Francisco. While gold and silver created the city's first fortunes, it was the port that sustained its growth and cemented its status as the economic capital of the American West. The chaotic waterfront of the gold rush, with its sunken ships and rickety wooden wharves, gave way to a more deliberate and permanent infrastructure. In 1863, the state of California took control of the waterfront from private interests, creating the Board of State Harbor Commissioners to combat corruption and systematically develop the port. The most significant undertaking was the construction of a massive seawall, a project that took decades to complete. This engineering feat established a permanent deep-water shoreline, creating the Embarcadero, a broad roadway and promenade that would become the city's maritime artery. Along this new front, a state-owned Beltline railroad was built, with tracks running the length of the piers. This system allowed cargo to be transferred directly from the holds of ships to railroad cars, creating a highly efficient intermodal hub that was the envy of other American ports. San Francisco became the primary nexus for trade with Asia, Hawaii, and Latin America, and the main point of entry for goods from the East Coast. Outward flowed the immense agricultural bounty of California's Central Valley wheat, barley, and fruit, along with lumber from the Pacific Northwest and the state's own manufactured goods. The men who performed the grueling, dangerous work of loading and unloading these ships were the longshoremen. Their labor was the literal engine of the port, and they organized to wield power commensurate with their importance. The work was physically punishing and notoriously precarious. Men would gather in a shape-up each morning, hoping to be chosen by a foreman for a day's work. This system bred fierce competition, but also a powerful sense of solidarity. Unions, most notably the International Longshoremen's Association, fought for better wages, safer conditions, and control over the hiring process. The waterfront became a crucible of labor politics, and the longshoremen's ability to shut down the port gave them immense leverage over the city's entire economy. A waterfront strike could paralyze not just San Francisco, but the entire Pacific coast, demonstrating that the city's soul and its prosperity were inextricably tied to the tides, the ships, and the men who worked the Embarcadero. The passage of the 18th Amendment and the subsequent Volstead Act in 1920, which outlawed the production and sale of alcoholic beverages, was met in San Francisco with widespread and systematic defiance. For a city whose identity was interwoven with saloons, breweries, and a celebrated bohemian culture, prohibition was not a moral crusade, but an absurdity to be circumvented. The city's extensive coastline and maritime infrastructure were immediately repurposed for a new illicit trade. A fleet of rum runners operated with near impunity, meeting larger vessels in the fog beyond the Farallon Islands to transfer cargoes of Canadian whiskey and Mexican tequila. Onshore, a sophisticated network of bootleggers, often protected by corrupt police and city officials, distributed the illegal spirits throughout the region. This flagrant disregard for federal law fueled the rise of a clandestine social world. The public saloon was replaced by the private speakeasy, an institution that flourished in the city's back alleys and basements, particularly in neighborhoods like North Beach. These hidden establishments, numbering in the thousands, ranged from rough working-class bars to opulent nightclubs. They became the epicenters of a new cultural energy, where the syncopated rhythms of jazz music, arriving with African-American musicians from the South, became the decade's soundtrack. This era of social license coincided with a period of intense speculative economic growth. The city's skyline began to rise, with the construction of steel-framed skyscrapers, like the Russ Building and the Pacific Telephone Building, financed by a booming stock market and unprecedented real estate investment. The prosperity, however, was unevenly distributed and built on fragile foundations. While fortunes were being made in finance and development, the city's powerful labor movement faced a concerted open-shop campaign by employers, leading to a decline in union membership and a suppression of wages for many workers. Beneath the surface of frantic construction and exuberant nightlife, the social fabric was being rewoven. The decade saw the rise of the automobile, which began to reshape the city's geography and create a new sense of personal freedom, particularly for women, whose social roles were visibly changing. This period of frenetic energy and speculative wealth was a facade, a decade-long party that masked the deep economic disparities and social tensions that would be brutally exposed by the financial collapse that lay just over the horizon. Long before the hills of Hollywood became synonymous with motion pictures, the nascent American film industry found a brief but significant home in the San Francisco Bay Area. In the early 20th century, the region's varied geography and bright, clear light attracted pioneering filmmakers seeking to escape the confines of East Coast studios. The most important of these early ventures was the S&A Film Manufacturing Company, founded in Chicago in 1907 by George K. Spoor and Gilbert M. Anderson. The name itself was a phonetic rendering of their initials, S and A. Anderson, who had become the industry's first cowboy star under the moniker Bronco Billy, recognized the need for a permanent Western studio to produce the popular Western genre. In 1912, S&A established this Western outpost not in San Francisco proper, but in the small, sun-drenched railroad town of Niles, located in Alameda County. The location was strategically chosen for its access to the Transcontinental Railway and its proximity to the canyons and rolling hills of the East Bay, which provided an ideal, ready-made backdrop for countless one-reel westerns. From this Niles studio, Bronco Billy Anderson churned out hundreds of short films, solidifying the archetypes of the heroic cowboy and the dramatic western landscape. The studio's greatest achievement, however, was luring the world's biggest comedic star, Charlie Chaplin, away from his rival, Max Sennett's Keystone Studios. In 1915, S&A offered Chaplin an unprecedented contract of $250 per week and a 10-0 signing bonus, a sum that stunned the young industry. Chaplin spent a creatively fertile, albeit brief, period working out of the Niles studio. It was here that he produced several films, including The Tramp. This particular short was a landmark in his career and in cinema history. It was in The Tramp that Chaplin famously first combined his signature slapstick comedy with a layer of pathos, creating a more complex, sympathetic character and ending the film not with a gag, but with the poignant image of the lone tramp shuffling down the road. Despite this creative high point, the Bay Area's dominance was short-lived. Filmmakers were increasingly drawn to Southern California, which offered even more reliable year-round sunshine, a crucial factor for the light-sensitive film stock of the era, and a greater distance from the legal reach of Thomas Edison's Motion Picture Patents Company, which aggressively pursued patent infringement lawsuits. By the end of the decade, the industry had consolidated in Hollywood, leaving Niles as a fascinating but largely forgotten prologue to the history of American cinema. The speculative prosperity of the 1920s ended with the stock market crash of October 1929, an event whose repercussions arrived in San Francisco with devastating force. As a financial center for the West Coast, the city was particularly vulnerable. Bank failures rippled through the economy, and the global trade that was the port's lifeblood contracted sharply. Unemployment, a minor issue during the preceding decade, became a widespread crisis. Shantytowns, derisively known as Hoovervilles, appeared on the city's margins, constructed from scavenged materials by families who had lost everything. The economic desperation was most acute along the Embarcadero, where the long-standing grievances of the longshoremen were magnified by the harsh realities of the Depression. For years, dockworkers had chafed under the shape-up system, a daily ritual where men were forced to gather and be selected for work by company foremen, a process that encouraged kickbacks and suppressed union activity. This system, combined with low wages and perilous working conditions, created a powder keg of resentment. On May 9, 1934, that keg exploded. The International Longshoremen's Association, ILA, under the leadership of the militant Australian-born organizer Harry Bridges, initiated a strike that shut down the port of San Francisco. Their demands were clear: a union-controlled hiring hall to end the shape-up, increased wages, and a contract that covered the entire Pacific coast. The shipping companies, unified under the powerful Industrial Association, refused to negotiate, determined to break the union. The strike paralyzed the waterfront for nearly 2 months, with cargo ships sitting idle in the bay and the regional economy grinding to a halt. The conflict reached its violent climax on July 5th, a day that would be forever known as Bloody Thursday. In a coordinated effort to reopen the port, police provided an armed escort for non-union scab laborers. Strikers resisted, and the waterfront erupted into a full-scale battle. Police deployed tear gas and fired shotguns into the crowds of longshoremen, who fought back with bricks and fists. By the end of the day, 2 strikers, Howard Sperry and Nick Bourdois, were dead from police gunfire, and hundreds more were injured. The deaths of the 2 men galvanized the city's entire labor movement. A silent, massive funeral procession for the slain strikers marched up Market Street, a display of solidarity that stunned the city. This event triggered the San Francisco General Strike of 1934, a 4-day shutdown of the entire city that was one of the largest and most successful in American history. In the end, federal arbitration granted the ILA nearly all of its demands, most importantly, the union-run hiring hall. The victory was a pivotal moment, cementing San Francisco's reputation as a formidable union town, and establishing Harry Bridges as one of the most powerful labor leaders in the nation. Paradoxically, as the Great Depression plunged the nation into economic paralysis, San Francisco embarked on 2 of the most ambitious and expensive public works projects in human history. These undertakings were not merely feats of engineering, they were defiant acts of faith in the future, transforming the physical and economic geography of the entire region. Construction began first on the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge in 1933, a colossal structure designed to conquer the 8 miles of water separating the 2 cities. It was a project of immense complexity, effectively 2 bridges joined by a tunnel bored through the rock of Yerba Buena Island. The western span, connecting San Francisco to the island, required the construction of the world's deepest bridge piers, sunk more than 200 feet through water and mud to reach bedrock. The eastern span, stretching to Oakland, featured a massive cantilever section. The sheer scale was unprecedented, requiring more steel than any single structure previously built, and enough concrete to pave a highway from San Francisco to New York. Even as this behemoth rose from the bay, an even more audacious project was underway to the west. Spanning the Golden Gate, the mile-wide strait connecting the bay to the Pacific Ocean had long been considered impossible due to its ferocious tides, corrosive fog, and violent winds. Under the direction of Chief Engineer Joseph Strauss, construction began on the Golden Gate Bridge. The project's most innovative and visually dramatic phase was the spinning of its main cables. A specialized spinning wheel traveled back and forth between the two towers, carrying a single steel wire at a time. This process was repeated over 27,000 times for each of the two main cables, with the individual wires eventually bundled and compacted into their final massive form. The project also pioneered construction safety. A vast safety net, suspended below the bridge deck, saved the lives of 19 men who fell during construction, who became known as the Halfway to Hell Club. The Bay Bridge opened to traffic in 1936, followed by the Golden Gate Bridge in 1937. In the depths of a national crisis, San Francisco had built not one, but two impossible spans, forever connecting the peninsula to the continent and creating enduring symbols of American ingenuity. The rocky islet of Alcatraz had served as a military fortification and disciplinary barracks since the 19th century, but its transformation into a symbol of ultimate incarceration was a direct response to a national crisis. In the early 1930s, a wave of organized crime, fueled by Prohibition and the Great Depression, had produced a new class of high-profile, seemingly untouchable criminals. The existing federal prison system was deemed inadequate to handle these figures, who often manipulated the rules and corrupted guards. In 1933, Attorney General Homer Cummings announced a solution: the conversion of Alcatraz into a new kind of maximum security, minimum privilege federal penitentiary. The island's natural isolation, surrounded by the frigid, treacherous currents of the San Francisco Bay, made it the ideal location. The transformation was thorough and severe. The old Army cell blocks were gutted and retrofitted with tool-proof steel bars, replacing the softer iron of the military era. The main cell house was equipped with remote-controlled locking mechanisms, and guard towers were positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. Tear gas canisters were embedded in the ceiling of the dining hall, ready to be activated from a central control room. Alcatraz was not designed for rehabilitation. Its purpose was to house the incorrigibles, the escape artists, and the most disruptive inmates from other federal prisons. The regime was one of monotonous, soul-crushing routine, intended to break the will of men considered beyond reform. In its early years, a strict code of silence was enforced, and privileges like work, mail, and visitors were earned through perfect behavior. This new super prison became a repository for the era's most infamous criminals. In 1934, Chicago mob boss Al Capone arrived, his transfer a public demonstration that no gangster was beyond the reach of federal law. He was joined by figures like George Machine Gun Kelly, kidnapper Alvin Creepy Karpis, who served more time on Alcatraz than any other inmate, and Robert Stroud, the Birdman of Alcatraz, who, contrary to his nickname, was not permitted to keep birds during his 17 years on the island. Over its 29 years of operation, the prison's reputation as inescapable became legendary. While there were 14 documented escape attempts involving 36 men, official records state that none were successful. The mystique of the Rock was sealed, a place designed not just to confine the body, but to erase the individual. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, instantly transformed San Francisco from a commercial seaport into the nerve center of the American war effort in the Pacific. The city's strategic location, its deep water harbor, and its industrial base made it the logical nexus for the immense logistical challenge of fighting a war across an ocean. The federal government poured unprecedented resources into the Bay Area, triggering a period of industrial and demographic change that was more rapid and profound than the gold rush. At the heart of this transformation was shipbuilding. Existing facilities like the Bethlehem Steel Shipyard at Pier 70 and the naval dry docks at Hunters Point were massively expanded. More significantly, entirely new industrial landscapes were created almost overnight. In the marshlands of Marin County, across the Golden Gate, the Bechtel Corporation constructed Marinship, a vast shipyard dedicated to producing Liberty ships, tankers, and other vital naval vessels. Similarly, Henry J. Kaiser established 4 new shipyards in Richmond. Across the bay, which became the most productive in the world, pioneering techniques of prefabrication and assembly line construction that allowed them to launch a new ship every few days. The demand for labor was insatiable, sparking another great migration to the Bay Area. Hundreds of thousands of workers poured in from across the country, most notably a wave of African Americans from the rural South, fundamentally and permanently altering the city's demographics. Women also entered the industrial workforce in unprecedented numbers, personified by the Rosie the Riveter archetype. This influx of humanity created an acute housing crisis, leading to the construction of temporary public housing projects and straining the city's infrastructure to its limits. San Francisco itself became the primary port of embarkation for the Pacific Theater. Fort Mason was converted into the administrative headquarters for this colossal logistical operation, coordinating the movement of troops and supplies. The city's piers, once bustling with commercial trade, were now dedicated entirely to the military, loading an endless stream of soldiers, weapons, ammunition, and provisions onto transport ships. By the end of the war, the San Francisco port of embarkation had processed over 1.6 million passengers and more than 23 million tons of cargo, more than any other port in the nation. The entire Bay Area had become a single integrated war machine, an arsenal of democracy that supplied the decisive naval and military power for victory in the Pacific. While San Francisco mobilized as an arsenal for the war effort, another, darker mobilization was taking place within its own neighborhoods, driven by long-standing racial animosity and wartime hysteria. In the months following the attack on Pearl Harbor, public and political pressure against the Japanese-American population mounted relentlessly. Decades of anti-Asian prejudice, fueled by economic competition and xenophobia, found a potent new justification in the name of national security. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. This directive granted the Secretary of War the authority to designate military areas from which any or all persons could be excluded. It did not mention Japanese Americans by name, but its implementation on the West Coast was aimed exclusively at them. Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt, head of the Western Defense Command headquartered at the San Francisco Presidio, was a chief architect of the removal, citing unsubstantiated claims of espionage and sabotage to justify the mass action. In April 1942, civilian exclusion orders began appearing on telephone poles and public buildings throughout Japanese-American communities in San Francisco, including Japantown and the Fillmore district. Families were given a matter of days to settle their affairs, abandon their homes, liquidate their businesses, and dispose of a lifetime of possessions for pennies on the dollar. Each person was allowed to bring only what they could carry. The majority of the approximately 50 people of Japanese descent forced from San Francisco were Nisei American-born U.S. citizens. They reported first to assembly centers, temporary holding facilities hastily converted for the purpose. For many San Franciscans, this meant being herded onto buses and sent south to the Tanforan racetrack in San Bruno, where they lived for months in crudely converted horse stalls, surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. From these assembly centers, they were transported by train to one of 10 permanent remote internment camps, such as Manzanar in the California desert or Topaz in Utah. No Japanese American was ever convicted of espionage or sabotage during the war. The forced removal was an unprecedented suspension of civil liberties, an action later determined by a federal commission to have been a grave injustice, motivated not by military necessity, but by race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. It remains a profound stain on the history of the city and the nation. Even as the Second World War raged towards its conclusion, the Allied powers were planning for a post-war order that could prevent a recurrence of such global devastation. The failure of the League of Nations necessitated a new, more robust international body. Following preliminary discussions at Dumbarton Oaks and Yalta, San Francisco was selected to host the founding conference. The choice was symbolic. As the primary port of embarkation for the Pacific Theater, the city represented the American commitment to the global conflict and its hope for a peaceful resolution. On April 25, 1945, just weeks before VE Day, the United Nations Conference on International Organization convened. The scale of the event was unprecedented. Over 850 delegates from 50 allied nations descended upon the city, along with thousands of advisors, staff, and more than 500 members of the press and radio. The city transformed into a global capital, its hotels filled with diplomatic missions, and its streets buzzing with a multitude of languages. The conference's public plenary sessions were held at the War Memorial Opera House, a venue chosen for its grandeur and security. The complex, intensive work of drafting the charter, however, took place in committee meetings across the city, most notably in the garden room of the Fairmont Hotel atop Nob Hill. For 2 months, delegates engaged in arduous negotiations, debating the fundamental structure and powers of the new organization. The most contentious issues revolved around the authority of the Security Council, the veto power of its permanent members, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, China, and France, and the balance between national sovereignty and collective security. The process was a monumental diplomatic undertaking, requiring compromises on issues of colonial trusteeship, economic cooperation, and the definition of human rights. On June 26, 1945, the culmination of this intense effort took place. In a solemn ceremony at the Herbst Theatre, adjacent to the Opera House, delegates from the 50 participating nations signed the Charter of the United Nations. This document, the product of 2 months of relentless diplomacy, established the framework for international law and cooperation that would define the second half of the 20th century. San Francisco, a city that had served as a gateway to war, now served as the birthplace of the world's foremost institution dedicated to peace. The end of World War II did not return San Francisco to its pre-war state. Instead, it initiated a new and equally transformative era. The millions of American servicemen who had passed through the city's port of embarkation were now demobilized, and a significant number, captivated by the region's climate and economic promise, chose to make the Bay Area their permanent home. This decision was powerfully enabled by the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, commonly known as the GI Bill. This federal legislation provided veterans with a range of benefits, the most impactful of which were low-interest, zero-down payment home loans. This financial tool, combined with a booming post-war economy, unleashed a massive demand for housing that the dense, built-out city of San Francisco could not meet. The solution was the suburb. On the hills and former farmlands surrounding the city, developers like Henry Dolger began constructing vast tracts of single-family homes. Dolger's Westlake development in Daly City, with its rows of identical houses famously derided as little boxes, became the archetype of this new suburban landscape. To connect these burgeoning bedroom communities to the financial and commercial centers in the city, an enormous program of freeway construction was undertaken. The Bayshore Freeway, later designated part of U.S. Route 101, was a key project, carving a high-speed automotive artery down the peninsula. This, along with other new highways, facilitated a fundamental reordering of daily life, predicated on the automobile. This suburban exodus was overwhelmingly a white middle-class phenomenon. As these families departed for the suburbs, a profound demographic shift occurred within San Francisco itself. The city's population, which had peaked during the war, began to decline for the first time in its history. Concurrently, the African American population, which had grown tenfold during the war due to migration for shipyard jobs, became more geographically concentrated in neighborhoods like the Western Addition's Fillmore district and Bayview Hunters Point. The post-war years thus established a new regional dynamic, a predominantly white suburban ring dependent on a city whose core was becoming increasingly diverse and non-white. This demographic reconfiguration set the stage for the complex urban challenges of the decades to follow. The automotive-centric logic of the post-war era found its ultimate expression in San Francisco's 1,948 trafficways plan, a sweeping proposal by state highway engineers to overlay the city with a grid of high-capacity freeways. This vision called for double-decker highways slicing through established neighborhoods, a panhandle freeway that would have bisected Golden Gate Park, and an extension of the Central Freeway through the heart of the city. Construction began on the first of these projects, resulting in the elevated Embarcadero Freeway, which walled off the waterfront from the downtown core, and the Central Freeway, which severed the Hayes Valley neighborhood. However, the physical reality of these concrete intrusions provoked a powerful and unprecedented backlash. What began as localized discontent coalesced into a citywide political movement, a coalition of neighborhood associations like the Telegraph Hill dwellers, business owners, and citizen activists. They organized letter-writing campaigns, packed public meetings, and directly challenged the assumption that automobile convenience should supersede the integrity of urban neighborhoods. The movement was not anti-progress, but rather a profound questioning of how progress should be defined. The turning point came in January 1959, when the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, responding to overwhelming public pressure, voted to reject 7 of the 10 proposed freeway routes then under consideration. This decision, which became known as the Freeway Revolt, was a landmark event in the history of American urban planning. It was the first time a major American city had formally rejected the federally funded interstate highway system in favor of preserving its existing urban fabric. The revolt effectively froze freeway construction within the city for decades, leaving projects like the Embarcadero Freeway and the Central Freeway extension as truncated monuments to a defeated vision. The success of this citizen-led activism preserved the human scale of neighborhoods like the Haight-Ashbury, North Beach, and the Marina, which had been slated for demolition. It fundamentally altered the city's trajectory, shifting the focus of urban planning away from automotive infrastructure and towards investment in public transit and the preservation of historic and residential character. San Francisco's decision resonated nationally, inspiring similar grassroots movements in other cities and demonstrating that citizen opposition could successfully halt the seemingly unstoppable march of the highway engineers. While the post-war consensus celebrated suburban domesticity and material prosperity, a potent counter-narrative was gestating in the Italian-American neighborhood of North Beach. This district, with its affordable rents and European-style coffeehouses, became a magnet for a loose confederation of writers, artists, and intellectuals who found the prevailing cultural climate spiritually vacant. The social infrastructure of this nascent movement was not in formal institutions, but in specific, accessible venues. Lawrence Ferlinghetty's City Lights bookstore, established in 1953, became its intellectual hub, the first all-paperback bookstore in the country, which made avant-garde and international literature widely available. Nearby, coffee shops like Café Trieste and the Coexistence Bagel Shop served as informal salons where ideas were debated and a new aesthetic was forged over endless cups of espresso. Into this environment converged a group of writers who would be collectively labeled the Beat Generation. Figures like Jack Kerouac, who sought to capture the rhythms of bebop jazz in his spontaneous prose, and Allen Ginsberg, a poet blending Whitman-esque lines with prophetic outrage, became the movement's central voices. They were united by a shared rejection of what they perceived as the rigid formalism of academic poetry and the soul-crushing conformity of American society. Their work championed intuition over intellect, experience over analysis, and a search for spiritual meaning through Eastern philosophy, particularly Zen Buddhism, and chemically induced states of altered consciousness. The movement was catapulted from a subcultural phenomenon to a national controversy on October 7, 1000, 1955, at the Sixth Gallery on Fillmore Street. It was here that Allen Ginsberg gave the first public reading of his poem Howl. The work was an explosive, incantatory jeremiad against the destructive forces of materialism and militarism in modern America. Its raw energy and explicit language electrified the audience, but also drew the attention of authorities. In 1957, after City Lights published the poem, Ferlinghetti and a bookstore clerk were arrested on obscenity charges. The subsequent trial became a landmark legal battle over First Amendment rights. Respected literary critics and academics testified to the poem's social and artistic merit, and Judge Clayton W. Horn ultimately ruled that the work could not be deemed obscene if it possessed the slightest redeeming social importance. The acquittal was a pivotal victory for free expression and served to canonize the beat generation, cementing San Francisco's identity as a sanctuary for dissent and the counterculture. The intellectual descent of the Beat generation provided the philosophical groundwork for what would become a far larger, more visible youth movement centered in the Haight-Ashbury district. This neighborhood of aging, spacious Victorian houses offered low rents and bordered Golden Gate Park, creating a perfect environment for the development of a communal, anti-authoritarian lifestyle. The catalyst that transformed this local scene into a national event was the Human Be-In, a gathering held in the park on January 14, 1967. The event brought together beat poets like Allen Ginsberg with emerging counterculture figures like psychologist Timothy Leary, who famously urged the crowd to turn on, tune in, or drop out. National media coverage of the Be-In, coupled with articles in the alternative press, broadcast an open invitation to a generation of disaffected youth. The result was a mass migration. An estimated 100,000 young people from across the country descended upon the Haight-Ashbury during the spring and summer of 1967. The cultural explosion they created was defined by several key elements. A new genre of psychedelic rock music, the San Francisco Sound, emerged from local bands like the Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, and Big Brother and the Holding Company, who performed at venues like the Fillmore Auditorium and the Avalon Ballroom. Central to the experience was the widespread experimental use of psychedelic drugs, particularly LSD, which was legal in California until late 1966. Its use was viewed not merely as recreational, but as a tool for expanding consciousness, a belief promoted by figures like chemist and prolific LSD manufacturer Owsley Stanley. This was underpinned by a social ethos that rejected consumerism, promoted communal living, and expressed strong opposition to the Vietnam War. However, the infrastructure of the Haight-Ashbury was completely unprepared for the influx. The neighborhood quickly became overcrowded, leading to sanitation problems and a strain on social services. In response, community-based organizations like the Diggers emerged, providing free food, housing, and medical care in an attempt to manage the crisis. By the autumn of 1967, the phenomenon had begun to collapse under its own weight, with the neighborhood overwhelmed by drug-related health issues, homelessness, and the commercial exploitation of the hippie image. The Summer of Love was a brief, intense, and highly publicized social experiment that ended as quickly as it began, leaving a permanent mark on American culture and cementing San Francisco's reputation as the epicenter of the counterculture. The closure of the Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary in 1963 rendered the island surplus federal property, a status that inadvertently created a powerful legal and symbolic opportunity for a new generation of Native American activists. Citing the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie between the U.S. and the Lakota, which stipulated that all retired, abandoned, or out-of-use federal land should be returned to the native peoples who once occupied it, activists saw a chance to make a profound political statement. On November 20, 1969, a group of 89 Native Americans, a pan-tribal coalition of students and urban families identifying themselves as the Indians of all tribes, landed on the island and began a 19-month occupation. Led by figures like Richard Oakes, a Mohawk student, the occupiers issued a proclamation satirically offering to purchase the island for 24 in glass beads and red cloth, highlighting the inequity of historical land transactions. Their formal proposal was to establish an Indian university, a cultural centre, and a museum. The occupation quickly established a self-governing community, with an elected council, a security force, and a school for the children on the island. They broadcast their message to the mainland through a pirate radio station, Radio Free Alcatraz, effectively bypassing the mainstream media to articulate their grievances directly. The protest captured the national imagination, drawing widespread public support, visits from celebrities, and extensive media coverage that brought the issues of the burgeoning Red Power movement into American living rooms. For the first time, a national audience was confronted with the history of broken treaties, the failure of federal Indian policy, and the demand for self-determination. The occupation, however, was difficult to sustain. The initial unity of the group began to fracture under the strain of leadership disputes and the harsh living conditions on the island, which lacked running water and reliable electricity. A tragic fire destroyed several of the historic buildings, and the accidental death of Richard Oakes's 13-year-old stepdaughter, Yvonne, was a devastating blow to morale. The Nixon administration, which had initially pursued a policy of non-confrontation, took advantage of the occupation's dwindling numbers and waning public support. On June 11, 1971, federal marshals landed on the island and peacefully removed the last 15 occupiers. While the occupation did not achieve its stated goal of reclaiming the island, its impact was monumental. It successfully ended the federal policy of tribal termination and ushered in a new era of Indian self-determination, leading to significant legislative and policy changes in the years that followed. The social upheavals of the 1960s laid the groundwork for a profound shift in San Francisco's political landscape. By the early 1970s, the Castro district had solidified as the city's most visible gay neighborhood, a demographic and cultural enclave that was beginning to recognize its potential for political power. This transformation found its most articulate and effective champion in Harvey Milk, a New York transplant who arrived in 1972. Milk was not a traditional politician. He was a small business owner who opened Castro Camera, a shop that quickly evolved into an informal community center and the de facto headquarters for his political activism. He first entered the political arena with a run for the Board of Supervisors in 1973. This campaign, and a subsequent one in 1975, were unsuccessful. The city's at-large election system required candidates to win a city-wide majority, a nearly impossible task for a neighborhood-based, openly gay candidate in that era. However, these early campaigns established him as a serious political force, earning him the unofficial title of the Mayor of Castro Street. The pivotal moment came in 1976 when city voters approved Proposition T, a charter amendment that dismantled the at-large system in favor of district-based elections. This change was a political earthquake, empowering neighborhood constituencies and minority groups that had long been shut out of City Hall. In the 1977 election, running to represent the newly drawn District 5, which encompassed the Castro, Milk was finally able to translate his grassroots support into an electoral victory. His campaign was a masterclass in coalition building. He forged an alliance between the city's gay community and other powerful but often marginalized groups, securing the crucial endorsement of the Teamsters Union by supporting their boycott of Coors beer. His platform was not narrowly focused on gay rights, but addressed the needs of seniors, working-class families, and racial minorities. On November 8, 1977, Harvey Milk was elected to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, becoming one of the first openly gay individuals to win a major public office in the United States. His victory was more than a political achievement. It was a powerful symbol of hope. His core message, delivered in countless speeches, was the necessity of visibility, of encouraging gay people to come out to their families, friends, and co-workers to dismantle stereotypes and fear. For a generation of marginalized people, both in San Francisco and across the country, his election sent a clear message that the political system could, in fact, be opened to those who had for so long been denied a voice. The political optimism that followed the 1977 election was shattered just over a year later by an act of political violence that plunged the city into profound shock. On November 27, 1978, Dan White, who had recently resigned his seat on the Board of Supervisors, entered City Hall through a basement window, a maneuver to bypass the building's metal detectors. White, a former police officer and firefighter, represented a more conservative traditionalist constituency and had frequently clashed with the progressive agendas of Mayor George Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk. Earlier that month, White had abruptly resigned, citing financial pressures, but then quickly sought to have his resignation rescinded. Mayor Moscone, under pressure from Milk and other liberal leaders, had ultimately decided not to reappoint him. Armed with a .38 revolver, White went first to the mayor's office. After a brief, heated exchange, he shot and killed Mayor Moscone. He then reloaded his weapon and crossed the building to Harvey Milk's office, where he fatally shot the supervisor 5 times. The discovery of the bodies sent a wave of confusion and horror through the building. The public announcement fell to the president of the Board of Supervisors, Dianne Feinstein, who, in a trembling voice, informed a stunned crowd of reporters and citizens, "Both Mayor Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk have been shot and killed." The news spread rapidly, silencing the city with a collective sense of disbelief and grief. That evening, a spontaneous and mournful procession began to form in the Castro district. What started as a small gathering swelled into a crowd of an estimated 30,000 to 40,000 people. In a display of profound and silent sorrow, they marched from the Castro to the steps of City Hall, each person holding a candle. The procession was not a protest, but a massive, quiet vigil. The sea of flickering lights moving through the city's streets became an iconic image of a community united in its grief. A silent tribute to the 2 leaders whose careers had been so violently cut short. The assassinations were a devastating blow, not just to the communities Milk and Moscone represented, but to the city's sense of political progress and civility. The candlelight vigil, in turn, became a powerful testament to the resilience of the movements they had helped to build. In the early 1980s, a new and terrifying public health crisis began to emerge, with San Francisco's Castro district as its American epicenter. In 1981, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention first published reports on a rare lung infection, pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, and an aggressive cancer, Kaposi's sarcoma, appearing in clusters of previously healthy young gay men. The mysterious illness, initially and stigmatizingly labeled gay-related immune deficiency or GRID, was met with widespread fear and a profound lack of response from the federal government. As the number of cases grew exponentially, the city's gay community was decimated. The liberation and joy that had defined the Castro in the previous decade were replaced by a pervasive atmosphere of grief and loss, as a generation of young men fell ill and died with shocking speed. In the face of national indifference, San Francisco was forced to develop its own strategy to combat the epidemic. This response was not top-down, but a grassroots effort that combined the resources of the city's public health department with the activism of the community under siege. In 1982, community leaders founded the Kaposi's Sarcoma Research and Education Foundation, which would soon become the San Francisco AIDS Foundation, one of the world's first and largest community-based AIDS service organizations. The following year, San Francisco General Hospital opened Ward 86, the first dedicated outpatient AIDS clinic in the world. This clinic pioneered a new compassionate approach to treatment, focusing on the holistic needs of patients rather than simply their clinical symptoms. From these efforts emerged the San Francisco model of care, a comprehensive, community-based system that became a global template for responding to the epidemic. It was a model born of necessity, integrating clinical treatment with extensive social services provided by a legion of volunteers. Organizations like the Shanti Project offered emotional support and practical assistance to the dying, while hospices provided dignified end-of-life care. While the federal government remained largely silent, San Francisco's Department of Public Health launched aggressive public education campaigns promoting safe sex practices, a controversial but highly effective strategy. This pioneering and compassionate response, forged in the crucible of immense loss, defined the city's character in a time of crisis. At 5:04 p.m. on October 17, 1989, the Bay Area was seismically arrested. As the third game of the World Series between the Oakland Athletics and the San Francisco Giants was about to begin at Candlestick Park, a magnitude 6.9 earthquake ruptured along a segment of the San Andreas Fault deep beneath the Santa Cruz Mountains. For 15 violent seconds the ground shook, unleashing a destructive force that the region had not experienced in decades. The most catastrophic failure occurred in West Oakland on the Cypress Street Viaduct, a double-decker section of Interstate 880. The upper roadway collapsed onto the lower level, pancaking a mile-long stretch of the freeway and crushing the vehicles below, accounting for the majority of the earthquake's 63 fatalities. Another critical transportation artery, the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge, suffered a partial collapse when a 50-foot section of the upper deck on its eastern span failed, falling onto the deck beneath it. In San Francisco itself, the area of most intense destruction was the Marina District. This neighborhood was built on landfill composed of rubble from the 1906 earthquake sand and mud, a foundation highly susceptible to soil liquefaction. The seismic shaking transformed the unstable ground into a semi-liquid state, causing the foundations of multi-story apartment buildings to fail. Several structures collapsed and numerous others were severely damaged. The shaking also ruptured underground gas lines which immediately ignited. The ensuing fires were particularly difficult to combat, as the ground failure had simultaneously shattered the neighborhood's water mains, rendering fire hydrants useless. Firefighters were forced to implement the city's auxiliary water supply system and run hoses directly to the bay to pump salt water onto the flames, a desperate but ultimately successful effort that prevented a more widespread conflagration. The event, broadcast to a stunned national television audience, starkly revealed the region's geological vulnerability, but also demonstrated the effectiveness of modern emergency response and the spontaneous resilience of its citizens, who immediately began rescue efforts in the moments after the tremor ceased.